Maybe I should be.
Yeah, that's me.
So that's me right there. See, that's my granddaughter.
Don't remember it.
That's me. Yeah, 5 years old.
So here's Bill.
He was digging the foundation.
Well, I need a bell or something.
That's very important. You want to know, he's 5 years old.
I night, but they're all good.
A bell or something.
Patty asked.
Okay, everybody. Ladies. Hey. Well, first of all, I want to welcome everybody here. I'm going to run this meeting today. I've never done this before. Depending on how I do, I probably will never do it again. So, and I want to make sure everybody signed. Did everybody sign when they came in? I hope, so we can keep track of everybody. And I need to. Patty won't be here. She's back in Maine. So I'll introduce our board members. Jill Medford.
Well, no, we've got to get that done.
I have to sit up here? Oh, okay.
Matthew Marshall. He was busy doing the wine. So Jill Medford, Mary Klein, Joan Berman, who this is her last meeting. Ashley Mobley, Jim Webb's out here somewhere. And we got.
I heard it.
And then our newest member, tell me that name again.
Dennis Katusa.
There you go. And anyway, that's our. And then I have a list of volunteers here. Patty left me a list of volunteers, and I realized between the volunteers and the docents that 3/4 of the town is either a docent or a volunteer. Volunteers are Jill Medford, Andrew Bailey. She's doing work on the lighthouse too. Lorraine Cook, Virginia Waters, Claire
Kelly.
That's it. Carl and Monica Cobb, and then we have the B. You did the B Hotel. We did the B Hotel and the Bat House, and then a bird house, which my wife donated. And then we have Alexander Cock. Is she here?
I haven't seen her.
Well, she's in charge of the assistant. She's doing a good job of that. A very good job. And intern Patrick Dewar for interviews. He interviewed Bill Dimmick, which you may know. Al Ellington, where she is right there, my old babysitter. And Carolyn Eisen. Well, it kind of dates me too. But now I'm gonna do the volunteer docents, and I hope I get the names right. And if I don't, be sure to tell me. Jill Medford, Jim Webb, Judy Smith, Martha Sue Davis, Maria Bartlett, Patrick Dewar, Barbara Snell, Sharon, I don't know that. Pam Topoleski, I'm sorry, Victoria Mays, Jack Tidwell, Patty Fleshner, Michelle McHenry, Mary Klein, Delora Newton, Hurton, and Laura Roback and Dennis.
Yes.
Now, somebody's going to read the minutes from last year.
Yeah.
I gotta get that now. This is the minutes from last. Ashley Mobley's going to read the minutes from last year.
All right, everybody. It looks like last year our annual meeting was held on April 30th, 2017. The meeting was called to order at 2:00 p.m. Directors present were Patty Fleshner, Joan Berman, Scott Baker, Jill Medford, Jim Webb, Matthew Marshall, Ashley Mobley, and Virginia Waters. Welcome. President Patty Fleshner welcomed everybody and introduced the board members and interns and acknowledged and thanked the docents and garden committee. She also acknowledged and introduced Bruce Pettit, who was a founding member of the museum. She also mentioned a new or noteworthy exhibits, namely the porcupine quill baskets in the Native American room, the new soil column and information on loan from Redwood National Park, and the photo exhibit of flowering plants of the greater Trinidad area in the Natural History Room in progress, the Pacific Glow Fox Farm in the Heritage Room, and the historical photographs of the scenic drive in the photo room. The minutes, Secretary Virginia Waters read the minutes of last year's annual meeting. of May 1st, 2016. Jim Waters moved and Jan West seconded the motion to accept the minutes. The motion passed. The treasurer's report. Treasurer Joan Berman read the treasurer's report for the fiscal year 2016-2017. Her summary is attached. Jim Waters moved and Tisa Jewell seconded the motion to approve the treasurer's report. The motion passed. Election of the directors, presided over by Vice President Scott Baker. Patty, Virginia, and Ashley, whose terms were up, had been nominated by the board for re-election for another 3-year term. There were no nominations from the floor. Ron Johnson moved and Joan seconded the motion to re-elect the 3. The motion passed. Introduction of the speaker. Patty introduced the speaker, Mary Spinis-Klein, and Mike Menezes, who ran the projector and is married to a relative of Mary, and thanked Jan West for the loan of audiovisual equipment. Mary's talk. Mary's talk was entitled 145 Years of Family Heritage in Trinidad. She gave an interesting and informative talk of her enterprising relatives who were active in many of the early ways of life of settlers after the gold rush, working in mills, farming, business. The talk was recorded and will be stored at the museum. The meeting was adjourned at 3:05 p.m. and to be followed by socializing and refreshments. Respectfully submitted, Virginia Waters, Secretary.
Now, we have the treasurer's report for the fiscal year 2017. This is part of the election.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
I missed it.
Hey, Scott. Just adopt the minute, or approve the minutes.
What?
I move we approve the minutes.
Oh, no, that's right.
Second.
Is there a motion to accept the minutes for last year's meeting?
So moved and so seconded.
Who seconded?
Joan.
Okay, all those in favor? You get, members get to vote too. Okay, well, pass, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to remain sitting. Standing is hard at the moment. So, treasurer's report for the last fiscal year. The fiscal year balance sheet, for those of you who look at things like balance sheets and profit and loss statements, the balance sheet shows total assets of $779,157, with $15,000 in checking and $67,000 in savings. This is basically our reserve fund. Gross profit for the year was $22,219, with total expenses of $22,249, yielding a negative net income minus $30, compared with a profit of $131 last year. Income benchmarks include the donation box, memberships, and events, all of which were up substantially. Very happy with that. The events, income from events, we had several. The Bob Hallmark Courtyard Sale, the Wells Garden events, and 3 Ollie classes. However, book sales of the books that the museum has published, as well as certain others, those sales are down, and in general, sales in the gift shop area are down. Bottom line, though, is that our income and expenses continue to balance out at approximately $22,000 to $23,000 for the year. I have copies of the profit and loss and balance sheet if anyone is interested in those. I'd say see me afterwards. I do have copies. So that's it for the year.
Is there a motion to accept the treasury report from fiscal year 2017?
I make a motion, we accept the treasurer's report.
Second?
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded, we accept the fiscal treasury report for fiscal year 2017. Is all those in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed?
Actually, here's a copy.
Thank you, Joe, for all the work. Now it's time for the election, and the board has nominated Mary Klein and myself and Matthew Marshall for a 3-year term. Is there anybody else that would like to nominate anybody else? Not. Okay, then we need a motion to accept these 3.
So moved.
Second, somewhere?
Second.
Okay, so moved and seconded that we accept Mary Klein, Scott Baker, and Matthew Marshall for a 3-year term. All those in favor?
Yes.
Aye.
Gosh. These 3 more years of bliss. I didn't know if you've looked around with the, Jim and Jim Webb and Jenny have really done a nice job in here. I think it's the best it's ever looked, I'm sure. And then Jill did the working basket exhibit here. And how long is that gonna be up?
It comes down in the fall.
In the fall?
Yeah.
Okay. And then the Heritage Room was under, Mary Klein, Alexander Cox, and Patty are working on the, a remembrance of Trinidad area World War I veterans. And they're started in here. It's really, it's gonna be something. We started that from the Saunders collection that was given to us. And, gosh sakes.
And even though that exhibit is not yet finalized,
Right.
there was someone who walked in yesterday and walked over and went, "That's my grandfather."
Oh. Oh, yeah.
Which one was it? It was Stone, Chris Stone.
Well, then the young man that hooked up our suddenly his grandfather's there. And I don't know if you've been out to see the garden, but Jill and everybody else, the garden club, garden committee, has really done a good job. It's really beautiful, so I
It was
recommend
a
that.
pretty day, so go out.
Oh, yeah, it is.
Yeah.
With the weeds out here in the dark.
Now, who's gonna introduce Roland and I?
Uh-oh.
Are you ready for this?
Are you ready for this?
I don't know why.
And I'm here to keep him honest, so.
Yeah, she knows it.
Roland Johnson and Scott Baker are going to give you stories, probably some true, probably some not true, but about growing
Well,
up in
hopefully not a
Trinidad.
lot. There's some that we can't talk about.
Yeah, and then there's the girl's point of view.
Well, there's statute of limitations that apply to a couple of them, so. Well, I'll get started.
Well, this is a museum society, so obviously it's about history, so it has to be true.
Okay,
Is there
yeah.
any questions about
Well, I think most of my stuff,
misrepresenting the past?
Mary can tell me if I'm wrong, but 'cause she was in that
You're so
era.
much older than I am.
Yeah, no.
You're my age group.
I'll show you how I got here. My father was coming back from Idaho. I'm glad he didn't buy the property up there, but he was gonna buy property they were living in Santa Monica. And I had just been born, and he was coming back, and he saw a sign across from the Antlers Motel that said 8 acres for sale. Yeah, so I'll give it a try. So he contacted the person, and it's right across. It was on Stagecoach Road, and so they had to crawl on their hands and knees, and there was this big rock, which ultimately he bought the property, and it was 8 acres, and they blasted the top of this rock off, and most of the house was built on that rock. And Steve Porter lives there now. He bought that for my folks. Slim Osborne, I don't know if you know any of these people. Slim Osborne, Howard Matson, and Carl Anderson built the house.
And
She
they rent a
remembers
house
it.
in Trinidad.
And then my folks, while they were building the house, they lived in one of the cabins at Ocean Grove for a year. And then there was an apartment above the garage at our home, and then we moved in there while they built the rest of the house. And my 2 sisters, myself, and mom, and my dad. The first people I met, I was introduced to, I don't remember meeting them, was Glenn and Janice Saunders. And they, I remember Janice working at the store when I got older, because every time I went in there, she'd give me an old-fashioned hot dog to munch on, every time. That was the first place I went. And then my father built parents built where the Beachcomber is now. They built that building. It was called Bakers of Trinidad. Picture of it right there. And it had a tackle shop, which my mom ran. They had a kind of a fountain, some hardware, and Dr. Earl had his first practice there when he got out of the service in the back. And it was kind of the hub. And then they had a fire in the back. My father turned it into apartments, which was the biggest mistake he ever made. And so he sold them to Dr. Pendleton after that. Why don't you?
Yeah, that's a good segue for how we got here. My parents were basically Army Air Force folks for when I was born and when my sisters were born. My dad left the Air Force. We were living at Hamilton Air Force Base down in the Bay Area, and he came to Humboldt on the GI Bill. He was going to be, he was interested in fisheries. He was quite the fisherman in all the places we lived when my sisters and I were kids. By the way, my younger sister is right here, Catherine. My older sister, 14 months older, lives in Tucson, Arizona. So we moved to Arcata. He was going to school and got the opportunity to buy a piece of vacant land, which was on the corner of Trinity and Edwards, and proceeded to build a house. We've got pictures of that. That was started in 1951 and finished in early 1953. So we moved from Arcata in 1953. I was 7 years old at the time, turned 8. So that place on the corner is the Red House, which is now the bed and breakfast. So that's where we were raised. It's interesting in that once we got here, my dad, after going through the effort of building this house with a local carpenter, decided that there really wasn't any money in being a fisheries graduate. All the jobs were like the fish and game, and they got paid near nothing, and so he had a family of 3 to raise. And so with the experience of building the house, he decided maybe he could sell building materials in this area because it was a long way from Trinidad to the first place that you could buy materials, which was in Arcata. In those days, it was Scenic Drive and West Haven Drive. It was a 45-minute drive from Trinidad to Arcata. And so he would go around to places in this general area, take orders, buy stuff wholesale, and deliver it. And we lived in that, so he was running this business basically out of a station wagon. And one of the interesting segues between Scott and I is when his dad had that fire, he mentioned the fountain. Now, this was an ice cream fountain, okay? Sodas and all that kind of thing, the old-fashioned way you go down and get an ice cream cone. That was important in the town, especially to my older sister. I can't remember whether it was to the younger sister, because she didn't have the run of the town at that time. And he had hardware in that store, Bob Baker did. And when he had that fire, he had all the smoke damage with everything. And my dad said, well, you know, I'm selling building materials. Maybe I can take this stuff, you know, even though it's smoke damaged, we got room in our garage, we can sell hardware out of there. So that started the business. He got out of driving around delivering things to starting to put inventory in that store. And that just grew until our garage was full. There was the sunroom that's on the west side of that house was paint and other things were in that. Built a warehouse in the back, and the entire yard was covered with stuff. Okay, from the sidewalks. I mean, there was no sidewalks, but everything was covered with materials. In around someplace around 1960, 61. There was a big storm in the harbor, and at the time my dad owned half of a fishing boat. The fishing boat sank along with 14 others in the big storm. And with a small business administration loan, he moved to building supply from our house, Trinity Edwards, up to the highway, where it's,
Next to Ocean
you,
Road.
you can see the remains of it, it's not an operating business anymore.
Where?
Next to Ocean
It's
Road.
right next to the storage place, where the Ace Hardware store used to
It's an
be.
A-frame building, is it still an A-frame?
Well,
that was the highway.
Yeah.
Sorry, Rod, was the
Harbor
Harbor
Lights, Harbor Lights, yes.
Yeah, so that was Harbor Light, and yeah, the main highway ran right down Scenic and right up Patrick's Point Drive. So that's maybe segue to your next.
Well, this is a picture of my dad and I when we were building the house. This is me when I first got out here. Now this is a picture taken in Daniel's front room, who is now Jim Baker's house. I have no idea why that picture was taken, but it's there. And this is my dad and I in the bedroom, and this, the front room. This is Charlie Earl and I, when we were about, I don't know how old we were, I was real old. This is my favorite dog, Speckle. He went everywhere with me. This is at Osborne's house. I don't know if you know where that is, across from the cow fire place. They used to babysit me along with everybody else, I guess. This is a house in Trinidad. This was, I was down at the dock making buoys for Hallmark, and somebody caught this shark, and so somebody from the Times Standard took my picture next to that. This is my goat, Gotcha, that was your name. This is our magical choir singing up at the cross on Easter sunrise service. This is my 8th grade graduation. These are some of the things I got hurt on, motorcycles and the like. This is a store in Trinidad. One story about when my folks, after the fire, my mom ran the tackle shop and she loved it, but we got rid of it. So we took all the tackles, boxes and boxes, rods, reels, everything back and put it in our garage and we went up on Stagecoach. And it was just sickening because every time my mom and dad would have guests come by, they all left with a complete fishing hookup. So it didn't take long before that was all gone. I mean, we're talking some really nice stuff. That just made my mom sick. And, of course, I worked out at home. Everybody kind of wanted to work at Hallmark's, and he was a good boss. It was hard work though. It was dark to dark. I mean, it was long days. But everybody, you know, really had fun down there, and well, everybody, like I said, everybody wanted to work there. Roland worked for his dad. Your dad was a tough boss.
All my friends would try to get a job either at Saunders or down at the pier. Of course, the best place to work was down at the pier because this was in the summertime and it was very busy. And as we get to be teenagers, of course, that's where all the girls would be.
Exactly.
Yeah. My dad, of course, had a business, and needless to say, I had a job. Now, I did get a lot of time off, but I didn't ever get to work down at the pier where I would have wanted to.
Well, I got a list of the guys, the gang, myself, Charlie Earl, Roland, Dick Fetters, Larry Hendricks. We always, that was the kind of the gang, and we'd always come by and try to get Roland to go to the beach and stuff with us, but his dad would have none of it because he was working. But on the way to the beach, we'd always go by Katie's, because she always kept a couple trays of salmon back for the kids. I mean, just help yourself and say please. But always, every day, we'd go by there whenever we went to the dock. I went to Trinidad Union grade school, as you can see, and also the Cub Scouts, Roland and I were the Cub Scouts together. This kind of is a neat picture here. This is kind of a bunch of guys from one of my birthday parties. But this is Roland and I at the Cub Scout meeting at the Anders Hotel, and my mom even kept my uniform. I don't know how, I can't believe that. It was just, let's see what else we got here. I worked at the Modern Garage for her grandfather and Harold Daniels for 50 cents an hour.
That's what my dad paid my friends too when it came to unloading trucks and stuff.
50 cents an hour, and that was another dark to dark job, especially during salmon season. Mo Saunders ran the post office, and I'll never forget, he always had a little green visor on, and you could always see it while he's chasing us out of the post office. Because we used to, about 4 of us, we'd open our folks' mailbox, or post office box, and we'd stick our hand through and wave at him, and here he comes. And of course, he had a bad leg, so we'd get out running.
Those weren't keys, those boxes, they had a combination.
Yeah. Oh, and then, quite a while, I mean, I think when I got out of basic training, we went up to, it was the Colonial Inn then, now it's Lairland's. And Glenn and Janice were there, and so I walked up to Glenn and I gave him $1. And he goes, "What's this for?" And I said, "Well, I just did a lot of thinking, and this is for the 100 pieces of bubble gum I took from your store." And so he thanked me for that. One event down at the dock when I was working down there is that some teenagers asked me to go on a boat ride with them, and I thought, you know, that's pretty cool. So it was a nice summer night, evening. We went out to the buoy out in the past Prisoner Rock, and they said, "Okay, the last one on the buoy is da-da-da-da-da." Well, I was the first one on the buoy, and then they backed off and left me out there. And it's got, I don't know if it's got a pendulum thing where it's got a bell and they beat it. So I grabbed these two things and started beating on the bell as hard as I could. They get back to the dock and Bob Walmart's there and he goes, "Okay, what's going on out there?" And who'd you leave out there? And he said, "Scott Baker." And he goes, "Go get him." And so they came out, finally came out and got me. But I think the neat part about Trinidad, I think, and Roland can probably say this, you know, probably say the same, is every parent in Trinidad had carte blanche as far as discipline. It didn't matter where you were or what you were doing. They didn't have to call Muriel or Bob and say, "Is it all right if I discipline Scott?" They just had the okay to do it. I mean, everybody in town did. But we didn't really do anything bad. I don't think I recall, you know, that I can remember. Probably trying to forget him, but I don't remember. Let's see. Well, my parents were good friends with the commander on Trinidad Head, and so I was pretty young. We spent a lot of time up there visiting them, and the old barracks, not the new ones. And like I said earlier, Allie Linger was my babysitter, one of my main babysitters. Bless her heart. And I think Roland needs to tell us about his rockets, because that was a big event in this town.
Well, I wouldn't start there.
I mean, they were incredible. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
they were. I mean, that was a big event when he said so. He made the best rockets of anybody. I mean,
What sort of rockets we got?
Well,
Real rockets.
let me
we didn't kill anybody.
let me talk a little bit about the time from, you know, when we were first, you know, youngsters going to school. Because Scott brought up, I think, an important point, and that is we kind of had the run of the town in the area around the town. There was none of this, "Where are your kids now?" My rule was home by dark. Now in the summertime, you know, that was pretty late. It was home by dark. It wasn't home for dinner, even though my mother would have preferred that. And that was violated to home by dark many times, but still, we had to run the place. Scott mentioned his dog. We had a dog, you know, dog Freckles, that basically, same thing. As long as it was a decent dog, that dog would walk me to school in the morning, stop at the boundary, I'd go on to school, assuming the dog would go home, but no, the dog would go around town to visit various people that would pet her, give her treats and stuff like that. But when I got off of school, the dog would be there. And wherever we went, the dog went along. The dog never knew a leash and never had any problem. But again, it was sort of like Scott mentioned, the town had, folks could discipline us. In other words, they just kept an eye on things. You know, you had the phone, that was it. If you wanted to get a hold of somebody's parents and something was really a problem, they get a hold of your parents. But we also, that went along with that, was obligations of other sorts. He mentioned the Daniels, who had part owners or half owners in the modern garage. I'm a couple of years ahead of Scott in school, so when I was still in grammar school, the Daniels boys, especially Don, were still around town. I think if anybody modeled getting into trouble, we modeled them. And T.J. Collins, those two were buddies.
Oh, yeah.
And they would hang out in the gear sheds that were on the same block as my house. Directly north of our house, little house that's there, I don't know who lives in it now, but George Corkin lived there. He was a fisherman. And the next one up on the corner was George Collins, okay, all in that same block on Edward Street, Trinity Street, I'm sorry. And they would kind of, the older boys in town would sort of keep track of us younger ones and make us do things and have us do errands for them and things like that. But their parents, Daniel's parents were Marnie and Harold Daniels, again where Jim Baker lives now. And she was the classic, I say, local mom in that anytime we'd get anywhere near that house and she'd see us, we'd get nabbed to do chores of various kinds.
Me too.
Right, and part of her license to use me was that, and I can't remember exactly the relationship, mother-in-law or something, but Electra Tarleton lived in the house immediately to the east of us.
Harold's grandmother.
Yeah, I think it was Harold's grandma, yeah. And of course, being an older lady and she was by herself, she had many, many chores that needed to be done too. So Marnie would nab me to go see Electra Tarleton and do things. And she was a wonderful lady, you know. Marnie was I wouldn't call her a wonderful lady for us kids, because she'd holler at us and make us do things.
She knew everything that was going on in town.
Oh, yeah.
Everything.
She was an amazing organizer though.
Yeah, she was one of
Yeah.
the main ladies in charge of things.
She's also the first woman mayor.
That's right, yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, and she could hold her own.
Probably the only
But I think it represented, I think a lot of the different families that were there, especially ones that have been there a long time, they watched out for us kids.
Well, when I worked at the Monte Garage, Don, I wouldn't say worked there. He'd show up and he had his buddy, what's the word? What's his name? I can't remember now. But they would take off. They had errands to do. Well, they'd take off and leave me there by myself for hours. And it was, you know, I'd pump gas, I had to fix tires, and they'd get back. It's time to close. About every day, just about every day. And I'd go and talk to Harold. I said, Harold, you got to get, you know. And he would, of course, he'd sit in his office and drink whiskey and chew beech nut. And then Johnny, her grandfather, was in the back doing all the work. And he had more patience. He had more patience than anybody I ever know, because I had a Model A that's up there, and it was my pride and joy. And then he'd let me work on it, Johnny, in the back. And he'd let me use his tools, and I'd get mad, and something wouldn't work, and you'd see a tool sliding across the floor, you know, and he'd usually tell me to go for a walk, and then he'd fix whatever I was working on. When I got back, it'd be just fine. But it was, I can't imagine living in a better town to be raised in. I mean, that's kind of how I got involved with the museum. When I heard that they were talking about it, I called Glenn and I said, you know, this town's been really good to me. I want to give something back. And so this is kind of what, you know, I think the museum board has a lot to be proud of. I think it's a nice facility. But I still want to hear about the rockets.
Well, okay, so I had a license to have the run of the town. I had access to all kinds of materials in the building supplies that other people wouldn't have. And as I got further along in grammar school, I got interested in chemistry. I was into science, and this was at the time when they were starting to, you know, put rockets up, and there wasn't anybody in space yet, but there was a lot of interest in that. I was in high school and taking the science classes and the chemistry classes and that, and there was an older boy there that had done a physics experiment. You had projects that you had to do in a lot of classes. So in the physics class, you had to have a project every year. They had to do something experimental. And he had this thing where he built a rocket, set it off, and I thought, that's a cool thing to do. So I got into experimenting with things like that. I did, like I say, I was in chemistry class, so I had access to stuff. And and frankly, in the day, you could go into a drugstore or into a paint supply place and buy stuff today that buy stuff in that time that it absolutely would be considered Class A explosives today, okay? So I did learn enough in my early experimentation by having a few things blow up in my face, little things out of, rifle cartridges, match heads and things, they were not safe. So, I experimented to the point where I was able to build some rockets, and we had access to, and I'm gonna back up a little bit because part of the history of places in there was, y'all know where College Cove is, and y'all know where the Elkhead is, where the state park, where you can go out and go to the blowholes and the cliffs and all that. Well, that was all private land. It was owned by a lady called Lydia Ty, and she ran cattle out there, okay? So it was fenced and there were cows out there. This was not a public place.
There's no trees out there.
But she, and even though there was one time where she fired a shotgun at me and a couple of my friends from, a couple 100 yards away to get us back across the fence, as she got older, she was less vigilant about watching the property. Eventually the cows were out of there and it was just an open pasture. I mean, now it's all trees. It was grassland, except for the very end where the brush, that interesting coastal brush is, the berries. And even though that stuff was only this high. So it was a perfect place with this big field and nobody around, to shoot up a rocket, because I got one that got close to 2,000 feet in the air. And of course, it was falling, when it was coming down, it was coming down almost as fast as it went up. So it was kind of dangerous.
And we're all going like this.
Yeah. I don't know about you, but I was in the bushes with my head covered up, because
Well,
younger sisters were there to go fetch and find the thing that came down.
Well, I got
In
it
the
with
hole.
the little parachutes at the end, so it wasn't.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
There was one time when one of the rockets hung up on its launch rail, and it went off sideways, and then it broke its attachment to the launch rail, and went shooting across the ground in our general direction and into the bushes, starting little fires all along the way. Luckily, we had plenty of help out there. They were able to, get the fires out, and just like, okay, we're gonna have to fix that. That's not good. So anyway, that was one of the things I got.
Did you have stages? I thought I remember you had some that would drop off a first section and then a second explosive.
I had one like that, but that was later on, and
Oh.
that was fired up a big lagoon.
Oh, okay.
When we first had telephones here, which were pretty minimal, you didn't have a phone number, you had a certain number of rings. And ours was 2 rings. And there was a lady, a nice lady, Irma Forbes, I don't know if you ever heard her. She lived right down, she was the best cook in the world. And, but she liked to get in on those phone calls. And so every time we'd get 2 rings, we'd pick up our phone, and the first thing we'd say is, "Hang up, Irma," and so we'd hear it click, because she picked up the phone every single time it rang, no matter what. And if we didn't tell her to hang up, she'd listen to whatever you were talking about. But it was, and then we had remember Jim Kirkpatrick, our town constable? He was a town constable, Jim Kirkpatrick. He lived right down there behind the store. And he had an old 49, I think it was a 49 Chevy pickup, and he could never catch us because that old truck it was slow. We could outrun it, but it was real noisy when you could hear it coming a mile away, and we'd all split, and then he didn't know what to do. But we never really did anything bad, but you could hear him coming a mile away. I don't know who called him. I can't remember who called and turned us in. But and then we had Charlie Earl lived over. Let's see, how would I get so you'd know where it is? Well, anyway, next to Katie's, just west of Katie's, that house there. And we, I was talking earlier. We used to his Dr. Earl's aunts lived right down below him. He built a house for her. And then they had a big lawn back there. We used to play football about every day. We played tackle football down there. And
it was sloping like that.
Yeah. Oh yeah. If you fell down, you'd slide into the rhododendron. But Dr. Earl, I think taught just about every kid. I've never seen a man with so much patience. He teaches, I think he taught us all how to water ski up at Big Lagoon. And he'd sit in that, and then he'd sit there and wait and just pull us. I don't know how he did it, but he taught just about every kid in Trinidad how to water ski. So that was kind of a hangout. That's where, besides they had a neat tree house there too, so we used to play in that. But again, it's just a great place. It's something like you read about. I mean, I wish my daughter could have been around in those days because it was everybody was safe and had fun. Everybody had a job, and everybody just enjoyed life, you know. And it was just a real good place that Mary could attest to that. A good place to grow up.
That's a wonderful place to grow up.
Yes.
I had a question. The guy with the loud truck that would chase you, he wasn't official law enforcement.
Yes.
Yeah.
He was a town
Yeah.
constable.
Oh, okay.
Trinidad Council, yeah. How old was he? He was
old.
old.
I don't know, maybe 60.
I'm not sure why he came after us because we could outrun his truck. I mean, it was just unbelievable, but it was just one of the things of Trinidad. And
We traded him out for Vern Stevens.
Vern, yeah,
By
yeah.
the time I went into high
Oh,
school.
yeah.
But then when they built the freeway, I was working at the gas station at the time, and it was just a complete dust bowl when they were working on it. It was just, and I don't know how many times I swept out the garage. It was just constant every single day. It was a couple times a day. There'd be dust this thick. And but it was a good place to work. It was I didn't get rich, that's for sure. But and then of course the gas was like 37 cents a gallon or something like that. You put $2 in your car and drive around all night. So it was pretty. Well, I didn't have a car until my Model A was the first car I had. So that was oh, and then another story about the Model A. We had two highway patrolmen, Leo Schussman, and I can't remember the other guy's name. And they lived in town, and they were quite active in the city activities.
McGarty.
Yeah, that was later. And so Leo Schussman had that Model A, and his brakes didn't work at all, hardly. It didn't have any headlights. It didn't, you know. He told me one day, he says, "Now you can drive that around Trinidad all you want, but he says if I ever see you on the highway, you've had it." And so one day I took it to high school. I took it to McKinleyville High. I was scared to death the whole day there and coming back. And but I made it. But yeah, that was I drove that around all the time. But it was because then my mom and dad's store, I used to hold it. There's a picture here. I used to hold a bait sign out in front, and I hated that job. And I'd stand there for hours, and people would come by, and I'd start talking to them, and I'd set the sign down, and my mom would come out and pick the sign back up. And then the fountain, that was kind of neat. My dad, I should have brought him. He had a couple old leather dice cups, and I've got the cups and the die inside them. And he kept them at the counter at the fountain, and so you could shake for a cup of coffee. You could shake for, if you wanted to, double or nothing. Shake for a sandwich or whatever, and I still have those. I remember that vividly. But that was kind of the hub until it hit that fire. I remember the night they caught on fire. We were home, and Dad got a phone call that said the store was on fire. When he got there, he said we didn't have a fire department in those days. And he said everybody in the neighborhood had their garden hose out trying to put it out because that was the hub. Everybody went there for one time or another. But the kids used to come over there and eat lunch. But then when the school built a new cafeteria, they put the kibosh to that. I still ate there, but the kids couldn't come over there anymore because they wanted them to eat in the cafeteria. So that would put the end of that. But it was I enjoyed it.
Let me segue something in there. Scott talks about the fire, and I don't remember much about that because we were pretty darn young.
Yeah.
And one of the things that fire, and I think there was another house nearby that burnt down too at about the same time. The town, they got a kind of a fire suppression thing. It was a trailer, and it had a pump on it and a little water tank. And of course, the city had some water, but the lines were so small they wouldn't furnish much. And I think I was about 10 when the old hotel burnt down. Now this was at the east end of Edward Street. I mean, the vacant lot is still there, next part, right out front across from Frames. that vacant lot, there was a hotel there, it was 3 stories high.
Trinidad Hotel? was
Yeah,
called,
the
right?
Trinidad Hotel, yeah, and it was mostly apartments, people weren't, it wasn't operated as a hotel, it was operated like apartments. People lived in it, a lot of people coming and going in those days in the fishing and the lumber industries. And, that sucker caught fire, and,
And a propane tank was involved, didn't it? Was it a propane tank
It-
that's involved?
it had 2 or 3 little fires up
Yeah.
until the time.
And then the big one.
You know, then the big one got going, and it was something domestic. There were wood heaters in it, and people, you know, with, wood stoves for heat inside of them. So I can't remember why it started, but boy, when it went, it went.
It was all redwood, everything.
They had that little fire thing that showed up, and of course, they squirted a little water on it and then just backed off. What I really remember was my dad with the garden hose
Yeah.
up on the roof and around the house because there were so chunks of burning material going straight in the air and kind of falling down all over town. And the red house that has a shingle roof. And in those days, the wood shingles for roofs were soaked in linseed oil to keep them waterproof and not to keep them from cracking. Needless to say, there was fear that would catch fire. So that was a big event right in the middle of the night.
Well, I went over the next day, a couple of days, or next day
Yeah, I
after
remember
the
that.
fire and found a bunch of melted silver dollars. It was a big pile of, and you could tell they were old silver dollars. That was my big claim to fame. But I remember that. It was, it was redwood. It was bone dry redwood, so it just went up like
Was it 3 stories?
It was
Yeah.
3.
Yeah.
3.
Yeah.
It was a big building.
I kind of remember that there was kind of an opening in the middle too for ventilation shaft or something. I remember it as a courtyard, but that doesn't fit the old photos that I've looked at. But they had like a whirlwind of flames going up out of the middle of that thing. I mean, it was,
Well,
you could feel the heat, 100 yards away.
Was that the only leftover mid-19th century
yeah, I think
big
so.
thing in town was the Trinidad Hotel?
Well, it was that size.
Yeah.
No, it wasn't. I mean, when I was a kid, there were old sheds down along Edwards
Mhm.
that were abandoned.
From the
Really
whaling
get
station.
into
The Big Four
The
was.
Big Four was an old
Eric's
building.
store across the street.
I think the most notable one, of course, was the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
talk about an old building.
What was the
In-
Big Four?
It was.
There's a
it was kind of
restaurant
salty,
bar.
It was,
Those
they moved
were
arcades.
Salters.
Made the wonderful food. It was wonderful.
But it was a bar, and they had problems there on occasion too. It was right on the highway after all.
We used to, Snuffy Smith, who was a Katie's brother, I guess it was, and he was a drunk, but he was
Brother-in-law.
the nicest guy. And one time he was sitting in a bar stool at the Big Four, and this other buddy and I, I won't mention any names, he probably doesn't want me to, but we took a couple firecrackers and fired them in the door underneath his chair. And they went off, everybody else scattered, he just didn't even move. But the modern garage had a old fire whistle. Do you remember that on top? It was
Not
hooked
really,
to,
but-
it was hooked to the compressor down in the back of the garage.
Right.
So one night, this buddy and I were gonna pull the whistle. It hadn't used it for years. We were gonna pull to see what happened. And so I set it all up and made sure the valve was on and the compressor went on before I got off work. And so that night we sneak over there. My buddy, he's a ways away, but I'm right next to the building, which there was a chain coming down and you activated it. Well, unbeknownst to me, it hadn't been going on for years, hadn't never used it, and the pipe was full of brackish, nasty black water. And so I didn't know that. I soon found out, but I pulled on it and nothing happened. I looked over and he goes, just keep pulling on it. So okay, so I kept pulling on it. And pretty soon I heard this gurgling sound, and then all of a sudden, this black, nasty stuff came flying down and just completely enveloped me. And I don't know what I told my mom when I got home that night, but I had to explain it because it was just everywhere. That was my big caper that didn't work out too good.
Well, I want to mention something else about the Catholic Church because, like I say, I can't remember exactly when they restored it, but, I mean, it was literally a ruin when I was a kid. I mean, we would get, even though the front door had a lock on it, it was in such bad shape that you could go in underneath through the, you know, the coverings along the outside and come up through the floor and be inside. And the pews were in there, and there were holes in the roof and all that, and it, you know, it was, why that thing never burned down is a miracle. Other than, except for kids, you know, sort of breaking in, going underneath, nobody was in there. But by the time I was in late grammar school, it had been restored, and my grandmother, who lived in San Jose, she was Catholic, and every once in a while she'd come up on Sunday and take us in there to the Catholic church service, and I still remember the first time I went in with her, how different it was from being restored, you know. The stained glass windows and stuff were still in that building. It's a miracle that they didn't break them out when they just let the thing go.
Well, they had those big beams holding up the roof inside that, you know, went from floor to ceiling.
But I mean, literally, there were holes in the roof and rain would come in. It was in that bad condition when it was taken on. I don't remember exactly how it got fixed, but it was one of those things that changed, you know, during the time, you know, I was a kid and in high school.
Well, it didn't, in those days, it didn't take a whole lot to entertain the people of Trinidad. And one of the big events on Saturday night was, every now and then, the Modern Garage, like I said, Harold Daniels, and these two boys, Bill and Don. Well, in those days, when you got a new tire, it was wrapped in brown paper, and that's just the way they were. And so what Don and Bill would do, and we're all watching, you know, they'd take an old tire and they'd wrap paper around it. And this is 101. This was main drag. And they'd take it right on that road where you go to Glenn's house. Just past that, they'd set it down by the road, and they'd tie a rope on it. And then they'd go up in the brush above it, and then these poor souls would stop thinking it was a new tire, and they'd stop and they'd hit the brakes and slide to the stop, and they'd run back. Just as they grabbed the tire, Don and Bill, and yank it up the back. And oh man, people used to get mad. But that's what we did for entertainment.
We didn't have television for a long, long time. I mean, we were like, you know, almost teenagers.
Well, and then the town hall. I mean, if those walls could talk, I mean, well, we wouldn't want to hear what they have to say, but there's some just, well, the ironic thing, the property lines in Trinidad are really, really messed up. And in fact, I'm not sure if it's still that way, but the town hall was 5 feet over on my parents' property. So that was a big joke of when they have an event at the town hall. They'd say, well, let's go sit over at Baker's property, and they'd all sit on the north wall. But I'm not sure if it's that way, but it was 5 feet over on that property. But that's some of my stories. Never got in big trouble that I remember. I mean, if you did, I didn't want to, you know, because everybody would know. I didn't want to embarrass my parents. I didn't care about me, but everybody knew everybody, and it was in those days. It was, you know, mainly loggers and fishermen, with a few professionals sprinkled in, doctors, dentists, you know, stuff like that. And then, but nowadays, of course, it's all changed. But it was whatever project we had, they'd work shoulder to shoulder, and there was no. It was, everybody got along, and Glenn, of course, carried everybody during the winter, and all the loggers and fishermen. And I remember they had, for their bookkeeping, I remember those drawers with the little tablets in there with everybody's name and town on it.
Well, everybody had a charge account.
Charge account, and you open this drawer, and there'd be all these little tablets with everybody's name, you know, in alphabetical order. And one time I used to go in and get 2 or 3 pieces of bubble gum. And Phil Byerly worked there, and he used to get so mad at me because he had to pull it out and get the tablet out and write 3 cents on there. So one day my dad took me aside and said, "No more of that. It's not going to work." So
yeah, we'd get sent down. You know, we're out of milk. You know, run down to get on the bike or walk down. You know, there was never any money. It was like, here's the milk, and they knew who we were. They'd write it down. We carried off. Similar things happened with my dad's business, you know, with the building materials, because it was very seasonal, people's income, and a lot of the people who were, you know, living in the local area, that's when West Haven was really heavily populated, and of course Cornell. Cornell had its own store, but it was a company store, and they charged a lot more for their stuff than the locals, because, you know, they could be taken off of somebody's pay, and a lot of the people there didn't have transportation in and out of there. I mean, Trinidad school was 70% kids from Cornell and West Haven. There weren't that many of us that actually lived in Trinidad.
Really, Cornell.
We ran shifts too.
Well, I know when they have heavy rains and would flood, the road going to Cornell.
No school today.
The road to Cornell would flood and they couldn't get the school bus in there, so we wouldn't have school, of course. And so, I used to, when it really rained real hard, I have a couple buddies, Dave Cole and Garth Denman, and I'd call them, I'd say, is the road flooded? And yeah, I go, all right, no school today. Because it was like 70%, if Cornell wasn't there, there wasn't anybody in school. So when the road flooded, we didn't have school. So that was kind of nice.
Of course, me and my sisters, we wouldn't find out till we walked the 2 blocks to school and found out it wasn't gonna be open. The school did go through quite a change too. The cafeteria was built, I think when I was like in 4th grade. I started Trinidad school in 3rd grade. And I think it was in 4th grade where they finally had, you know, the cafeteria gym was under construction in one wing. And I don't think that even held all the kids at first. I mean, I looked at one of my school pictures and there's like, you know, 30 kids, you know, in a class. And there were a lot of multiple classes. I mean, like the 8th grade, there weren't as many, and I never knew why. But
My grade, we ran shifts. We had the morning group and the afternoon group to fit everybody in.
yeah, so that happened too. I don't ever remember doing that, but I think you
Yeah, I was
probably
in
did.
third grade.
Yeah, third
Second and third.
Yeah.
Third grade.
Yeah, yeah.
So they,
They were down the more.
it's amazing to think how many kids came into town, and they all came out on the buses from Cornell. I mean, it took a half an hour to get from Cornell to Trinidad.
My 2nd grade teacher, Rudy Rayburn, she was a sweetheart.
Oh,
Her husband, Will Rayburn, was a bus driver. And he used to mess with me something terrible. And I was the last kid on the bus as it made on Stagecoach Road. Rain or shine, I'd be by myself, and he'd go on the bus, and he'd go by our parents' driveway, and I'm screaming and yelling and screaming, telling him to stop, and he'd get about a quarter of a mile down the road, and then he'd stop. And he'd say, well, I can't back up, Scott, I'm sorry. I don't know how many times he did that. He said, I can't back this up, you're gonna have to, rain, especially when it's raining. Of course, I asked for it. Remember the hamburger stand over here? Was it, Allie, did Axel run that? She and Bonnie for a while? The hamburger?
The one just north of
God, they were
town.
good hamburgers. They were only like
Yeah,
$1.50
oh, they were
something.
good.
And I used to go over and I was I don't know how I got the job, but I'd go over and get those from my 8th grade, Mrs. Thompson, my 8th grade teacher. She'd always send me over about 11:45 and get her hamburger, the hamburger stand.
Well, now when I was in high school, there was another hamburger stand run by Jim Mackey's mom. I don't know if you know Jim Mackey, but he was a butcher there at Saunders forever. And she made really good hamburgers too. I'd go down from the building, by then the building supply was up on the highway.
That was the one.
And I'd drive down there and get burgers for me and my dad and go back.
Oh, yeah, that was just, they were just.
And I'd take the money out of the till.
You did?
Of course, I didn't get paid. You think I got paid?
Oh, that's right.
I had an account. My mother was the bookkeeper, and I was one of the accounts payable in her book. You know, I put in my hours, and they write it down. And you know, if I needed money, I'd take it out of the till and subtract it off of that. No, that went on for years until I was in college. You know, I mean, I ran a good enough account to buy a car when I was sophomore in college.
When I worked down at the dock, Bob was a great boss. I mean, he was pretty loose with us.
Yeah, because he was loose.
Yeah.
He was easy.
But I mean, we worked really hard, but he paid us at the end of the summer. He didn't pay us every month. And we'd get a hell of a check at the end of the summer, but gee, I mean, I lost my mom and dad during this, and then I had to pay him, of course, at the end of the summer, but he gave us, we got a big check at the end of the summer, but man, it was tough going during the interim. I have one good story, and I'm about done. I bought this skiff, a 10-foot skiff from a commercial fisherman that used to use it to drive out, row out to his boat. And then my dad bought me a little 3-horse 7-rib outboard. And so one day I wasn't working, and I headed down to the dock and I tied it up at the ladder, you know, those little ladders that used to by the winches. But I tied it up at low tide, and I didn't think about it. I didn't leave quite enough rope. And I came back, and my boat was gone. And I wanted to know, where was it? And they said, oh, it's still tied up. So I looked down, and sure enough, you could see the end of the rope tied into the ladder, but the rest of it was underwater. Oh, geez, I learned my lesson on that one. That was terrible. I was so embarrassed. Oh, geez. Everybody was waiting for me to come back and get that boat.
It is interesting because the little boats, it reminds me of that, because all the fishermen would pull those little boats up on the beach there, you know, next to where the boat launch is, on that protected beach. And they'd go out to their boats, they have time out, go out and do their thing, especially, I'm thinking in the salmon fishing season. And then pull the boats up and go, because there weren't storms in that time of year. But as kids, if we had time in the afternoons, we'd just go down there and take a boat.
Yeah.
And you
My
know,
sister
but
and
they
I
had
had
oars, so they didn't have a motor, and go out around the bay. And if there was some waves, you know, further down, we'd get and ride the waves into the beaches and go back and put the boats back.
Well,
Didn't
sometimes,
even think about it.
sometimes exactly, we'd ride.
Unless the guy was looking for his boat. then
Oh,
we'd get-
we'd get Bob's rental boats, and they were pretty big boats, they were six, you know,
Yeah, they were 6.
and
they were big ones.
we'd ride them, you know, the waves, and a lot of times we'd beach them, and we were too small, we couldn't get them back off the beach. So Bob would have to come and get them off the beach, and then the next day we're doing it again. And he was really patient with us kids. I mean, it was a good place there.
I
Again,
borrowed
good place to
one
go.
and got stuck. My sister and I had a laughing fit way out by the Pilot Rock, and we lost an oar. And we just
Well,
sat there.
the teenagers used to water ski in the bay, and he really didn't like that. But the teenagers were jumping off the dock one day, and I thought, well, if they can do it, I can do it, and which I did, and I'll never do that again. I hit the water and everything quit. I mean, nothing worked. I mean, I couldn't breathe. It was so cold, and I mean, just everything quit. I came out of the water. I couldn't even scream if I was drowning. And luckily there was a boat. I grabbed a hold of it, and oh my God, I almost drowned. I mean, it was so cold. But I'll never do that again.
I never did go in the ocean off the dock.
Oh,
A few times went into beaches, but like I say, it's.
well, I only did it once.
Well, I remember a friend of Dick Fedders who, in the day when surfing was just getting going, we were kids, I mean, it wasn't popular around at all. We didn't see people at Humboldt or anything do surfboards. And he got a surfboard, and of course, first time he tried it, it's like, you can't stand the water. So next thing is he got this this wetsuit, you know, I mean, it actually went from here to here, you know, and he put the suit on to go out there. And he'd last maybe 10 minutes even with that on, come in and just shivered and blew. It's so much fun, so much fun.
Yeah.
Of course, you just start a fire, you have a little fire so it can warm up before you can make it up the trail.
When it's a beautiful, beautiful day, you think, well, geez, you know, that water's can't be that cold. Oh, geez. I don't care. I mean, it was, you know, it'd be 70 degrees out and the water would be 40. That was terrible. But that was my one experience of jumping in the bay.
Well, I'm just wondering if anybody has any questions about, you know, structures that were in town or businesses or anything like that.
Of course, they might be limited to some of the ones that we.
I'm curious how many restaurants there were. It seems like you had all sorts of good food to go
The
get.
main restaurant down at the dock was underneath the dock at one time.
Yeah.
And a storm took that baby out, but that was, and I always used to, I was talking to Bob Hallmark one day, because it was literally underneath the dock, or below the dock, next to it. And I said, Bob, it's none of my business, but where did the wastewater from that restaurant go? I was just curious. He just grinned at me, you know, cause we
Well,
don't,
they
yeah,
didn't
well,
have-
in the bay.
The thing was, they didn't have a bathroom in there.
No, they
There was
didn't.
no bathroom, it was just the
Just this
wash water.
kitchen.
Gray water.
But yeah, literally, you'd go off the side of the dock and there was a staircase that went down and it was, you know, the floor was probably 8 feet below
Yeah.
the elevation of the dock. And they had it in there, it only lasted a couple of years.
Yeah, and they had these big white footprints on the dock, painted to see to the entrance.
Yeah. And other restaurants, there really weren't any. The hamburger stands,
Colonial Inn,
Colonial Inn,
Manning's on that.
and Ocean Grove had food on and off the whole time.
Manning, the Colonial Inn, the Mannings were just great people. They lived upstairs and the restaurant was downstairs, and then they finally built a house across the street and then they sold it. But I have a great story about Don Daniels bought the Colonial Inn. I don't know if you heard this. It was a great story. He did a promotional Easter event for the restaurant, and so it could only happen to him. And so he had these rabbits. He got these rabbits. He had a lawn area out in back, and I guess he had these rabbits out there because it was Easter. And I wasn't there. My family wasn't there. But I guess during the course of the evening, he heard all these people downstairs just screaming and yelling. What had happened? These raccoons attacked the rabbits that were there for the people eating right there. They're eating, and here's a big window. I guess it was just a catastrophe. It was just, oh God. Yeah, raccoons ate all the rabbits right there.
That'll kill your appetite.
But I liked it when Manning had it, because when my folks would go out of town, I'd go up there and eat dinner all the time, and I loved that because it was so good.
Then, in the early 60s, 61, 60, Ed and Eleanor Slack
Yeah,
bought it.
and the candy.
I went to high school with their daughter. She went to high school.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they ran for a long time.
But yeah, that was and then across the, I don't know, Jill, remember that garden across the street behind Larrabin's where we had didn't we have an event there last couple of years ago?
Yeah.
It was good. Mrs. Day, she was a really good friend of my mom's. And I remember going up there all the time. I was a little kid and with my mom, and she was the hardest working woman I ever knew. And she started that whole thing years and years
Yeah,
ago.
that was a flourishing business. And-
Oh, boy.
As I understand it, next door, there was a garage, there was you take your car to.
That's where I used to take my Model A there too. He had a garage in Arcata years before that. But, yeah, it was, the Pettit, Bruce Pettit, you talked about Bruce Pettit, they lived across the road from our driveway. And my sisters went to high school with them. And that's about all,
They lived up Stagecoach?
right across the
Pettits?
street from our driveway
Huh.
at one time, yeah. So, that's about all I got. Unless you got any
Oh,
questions?
could go
Yes.
on all day.
Yeah.
Pretty sure.
Well, yeah, I could, but I don't want to.
I wonder if you guys remember the haunted house up there on Stagecoach Road? That
Across from
kinda-
my grandparents' place.
Yeah, the one that
That's
everybody.
the Ties, that was the Ties house.
That
That was the,
oh,
yeah.
Wait,
Oh,
tell us.
okay.
That was across the
Yeah,
street.
that was kind of a
Right
creepy
across the street
double
from
dare
where
kind of
the
Right.
place.
place is, yeah.
Oh, okay.
He was abandoned.
But that was all open, there were no
I-
trees there either.
I
Yeah, so,
just love
yeah.
that story, that you could be on the east side of Stagecoach and you could,
You
there's
could see
the ocean view, yeah.
Oh, I got one more story. Down at the dock, the floating things they tie the boats to, years ago, well, they still do it. But they had, because they clean their fish there, there'd always be those little fish just
Oh, you used to store
everywhere.
those babies.
And so there'd be holes in knot holes in the thing, and we'd sit there with our little line and with a hook on some bait on it, and we'd catch those little fish. Well, one day, I had my line in there, and I got a black snapper or whatever, and it wouldn't fit through the hole. And so I'm sitting there going, now what am I gonna do with this? And I tried to reach under here, I couldn't get it, so I just cut the line, but that was my big catch. But we could catch those one after
The
another.
summer when I was 15 years old, there were people that were casting off the floats at the pier catching salmon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The bay was full of bait fish, and I mean you could literally see from up top, especially up on the upper the upper level of the lighthouse, which you could go up to when I was a kid. I mean, there was a stairway that went, you could walk on the top. And you can see as a boat would kind of go through the bay between where the boats are and Clam Beach, you'd see kind of a shadow that would go like this around the boat, and it was little fish. They were so thick in there that you could change the color of the water when the boat would go through. And people were trolling in the bay and limiting out the salmon. And it was the same year that I think 4 or 5 different boats got caught in the breakers on Clam Beach and went in, and there were 5 people that drowned that day. Because they were literally trolling along the edge of the breakers, and something would go wrong, and all of a sudden they're in the breaker. Next thing,
Of course, when we were kids, it rained, I mean, literally, it rained all winter, and then it was foggy all summer. There'd be a little break in the afternoon, and that was it. Nowadays, I mean, this weather here was unheard of. I mean, it was just, and I remember one real foggy summer, they lost 2 boats on Clam Beach, and the people didn't have their life jackets on, or they didn't make it. They all drowned. There's 4 of them that drowned. And
Don
just-
Daniels went in on Clam Beach
Yeah.
fishing.
There's
Survived it, obviously.
There was a guy, remember George Corkin?
Yeah, he's my neighbor.
He had the
Yeah, it's our
imp,
neighbor.
he had the imp, and he went into Clam Beach. It was a commercial boat, and he tied himself to the wheelhouse and rode that baby into Clam Beach. So, I mean, there was some
He
impressive-
also lost a boat in crab season, and survived.
Mhm.
And the guy that was fishing with
Twice
did
he
not.
lost,
Yeah.
he lost boats. I remember that when you were talking about, how many boats, 14 boats or something like
Yeah.
that? It was really sad because everybody that owned boats was down at the dock or up on the bank watching, and there was nothing they could do. They just
Yeah,
watched.
that's
I remember
awful.
your dad's boat went around the head and never be seen again. I mean,
Yeah.
it was-
Yeah, it was the last, they were
It's terrible.
disappearing in the night, and when it got to be dawn, I mean, the fishermen, if they, with spotlights, they look for the boats, and if they disappear in a storm, a lot of times they go looking at them on the beach, because they don't come in on the beach, and sometimes if they came on the sand, they could rescue the boat. If they came in the rocks, oh well, it would break up.
Right.
And they were looking for boats on the beach, and the boats were disappearing in the night. And where are the boats going? Well, the storm was so strong that it created a current, came around Clam Beach and through the bay where the boats were, and that current was pulling the boats out to sea, and then the waves were coming in, and the boats, were tight on their mooring, and so they would hop. They usually use railroad wheels and things like that for anchors for the boats. This is in the crab season. And what they were doing, the boats were getting dragged out to the point where the bigger waves would catch them, rip them loose.
Between Pilot Rock and the
And,
head.
and they'd go
Big
out
ones.
around Pilot Rock, and the wreckage was coming in on the front beach, but nobody was looking for them. So it was about dawn, and there was just 2 boats left in the bay. The one that my dad was a part owner in was like 100 yards off of its spot, leaning out
Dragging.
to sea. And the bow of the boat was like this because the current was pulling the boat, and the anchor was holding it back. And little by little, we just watched the thing all of a sudden it would hop 5 or 10 feet, hop 5 or 10 feet. He tried to get a diver to go out, and the guy almost said he was gonna do it. And then it got far enough out, and a big wave came through, one of those big breakers, and the boat just disappeared. I mean, one wave, and it just was there 1 minute and gone the next. And that afternoon, we found the nameplate of the boat on the beach out front with all this other wreckage. So it was, it shows how risky it would be to be a crab fisherman in those days.
Well, in those, at that time, it was, I'm sure your dad did too, they all had live boxes tied to the backs, and the boats, with crab in them, they keep them alive in there, and then they lost all that. I mean, they lost a lot of revenue too.
Yeah.
Not just.
And by the way, I've got a picture up here from 1959 of the crab feed, me and a friend. It was my first year in high school, and I think that was the first crab feed.
And it was all you could eat, I remember.
Well, yeah, it was all you could
You
eat.
ate till you're stuffed and then you
Yeah.
left.
And
It was all outside.
the reason they had the crab feed was because they had such a bumper year of crab and the price was really low. And so they basically bought the crab directly from the fishermen, a little higher rate.
Processed in the Katie's.
Yep, yeah, processed it right there and had a crab feed.
Had a bunch of people standing around the table
And it
crying
was-
crap. Oh,
And it was very popular.
Oh, yeah, it went for a couple of years, actually.
Yeah, well,
Isn't
I
that a
remember that
fundraiser
one
for
year,
the
they ran
fire
out of
department?
crab and Bob Wall, and there was a storm like crazy, and Bob Hallmark went out by himself, which they never thought they'd see him again. Went out and pulled a bunch of pots and brought them back in and processed it down there. He was a
That was
real,
quite the history of
real
that.
salt.
So if the weather was as you described, were there people coming here?
No, it was
in the
windy,
summer?
it was windy, it had been windy and stormy, and the ocean was terrible, it wasn't
Yeah,
raining.
no, I mean of just, the climate was, it was pretty awful here,
It
winter,
was real,
summer,
yeah.
whatever.
Yeah, nobody
But were
came
there
here.
people coming in the summer largely to fish?
Oh, in the summertime, this place was nuts.
Yeah, all the way up Patrick's Point Drive, they were like, I mean, all those different places, Shadow Lodge.
Cabins and the-
Bishop
Bishop
Pine.
Pine Lodge.
Yeah, people would
Packed.
move in there with little campers or with tents, and a lot of them they'd go fishing every day, you know, and they'd be there for some of them for a couple of months,
Wow.
and just,
And when the fishing boats usually came in at, well, they came in every day at noon. They made 2 trips, and they'd back into the dock, and then it
those
would
were
be
party
nothing.
boats.
Yeah, party boats.
And the others would, you
There'd be
know,
100 people, I'm not kidding, 50 to 100 people up on the dock every day looking when the party boats came in.
a lot of people would go out in the morning, and they'd limit out, and they'd come back in, take their fish up to where they were, and they'd go back out in the afternoon and get another limit.
And there was one, my dad and I went out on the corridor once in George Collins' boat, and I'll never forget this, and the guy that did Bugs Bunny's voice, he and his wife were on there. And I never heard his voice, real voice, the whole time we were out fishing, he talked like Bugs Bunny the whole day. And George Collins had an external speaker on his boat, and sometimes he played music through or something, but he got this guy on it, and he's talking like Bugs Bunny as they're back, it was hilarious, and people on the dock were just cracking up, but I never did hear his real voice, he was quite elderly at that time, I'm not sure, but it was a panic. Just look
Well, you
out.
see, we could remind each other of stories back and forth here for the next 2 hours.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I got so seasick, Charlie Earl, a good friend of mine, he worked on a deckhand for the Cricketer one summer. I tried it one day, and I got so sick, seasick, that I slept down. I was down in the boat on a bunk sleeping. I couldn't. And I was so sick. I looked like Mick Jagger when I got off that boat. I was just, oh God, I never went out again. But now I have to take the patches. But otherwise, it didn't bother Charlie. I wanted to work on that boat so bad, but it didn't work.
You guys didn't mention the tree swing behind the school.
Oh, that's right.
At State Park, that treacherous,
Where the park is over here?
blackberries.
It's the best swing in the world. It was, if you fell off, they didn't look for you. But
Yeah,
it was a
it
good
was
swing.
like 10
It
feet
was-
thick of blackberry vine.
In fact, a
You
friend
didn't wanna
of
fall.
ours, I think I told you, an older guy, he fell off it one day and we got so scared, we took off running. But he broke his arm. And, but it was within the school, but we used to go to that recess, but school put the kibosh to that thing. It didn't take long.
There was one over here, and there was down.
And there was one over around the store and
And one down underneath the Memorial Lighthouse.
we used to, well, the
That was
Memorial
a
Lighthouse,
sliding
remember we used to slide down there with,
Slides?
we had
Yeah, yeah.
kids
Slide down cardboard.
cardboard boxes and we'd slide down the hill into the brush. That was brilliant.
My dad paid a friend of mine and I one summer on our spare time to open up the view a little bit. And of course, all these alder trees are growing down there. And it was like, you know, these tall ones. Would you guys go down there and give some axes out of the store, cut down some of those trees? Nobody cared, as far as I know. And so it was like, so we went down there the first time and worked and cutting those trees down, and watched it kind of fall through the brush, and it would just barely find its way to the ground because it was going through all the limbs of the other trees. So it was Jim Huff. I don't know if you remember Jim
Oh,
Huff.
sure.
This he said, I'm gonna climb up on one of those
Exactly.
trees. I'm gonna climb up on one of those trees as we get ready to cut it down, and I'm gonna ride it down.
Exactly, that's what we used, cut them halfway through.
So he did, he goes up in the tree, and we whack him down with the axe, and the tree falls, and literally it's like down through the brush, and it's like, he's home, yay! It was like a thrill ride.
It was.
So, a couple of days later, we were doing it, it was Dick Fetters this time, and up in this tree, he starts to fall in the tree, you know, instead of falling straight, it rotated like this. So he's hanging on to the bottom of the tree, and it hits another one and popped him off. He fell like 20, 25 feet down into the bushes, and so we thought, oh my God, he's dead. You know?
We never thought of anything.
And then the tree continues to fall about where he was, but it never made it to the ground, and it's like we scrambled down there, just knocked the wind out of it.
We
We
had a big patch
better
of
quit
alders.
doing that, you know.
Well, that's my mom, we had a big patch of alders next to our house up on Stagecoach, and the same thing, we'd cut them halfway through and crawl up and rock them, and they crack, and we'd let them down. Not thinking you could get a limb through you like
Right.
We used to, and then my mom caught us doing it, and that was the end of that.
Yeah, a certain amount of stupid stuff went on, you know, people falling off the rocks.
Oh, yeah.
Falling in rocks, and, nobody died.
No, yeah.
Larry Hendricks ended up with 8 stitches in his forehead, sliding down the hill in Elk Head.
Oh, that's before they had that, before the stairway,
Good times, good times.
all that clay stuff,
There was no stairway,
yeah.
we would camp out when I was in high school down at College Cove Beach.
Oh, yeah.
Camp out, you'd get,
Clay slide.
one of my friends would steal liquor out of their store and we'd go down and drink it.
Well,
I've been the night on the beach.
a good friend of mine his dad owned, Jay Powell owned the Ocean Grove. And that picture of me at the 8th grade graduation, earlier that day, we had gone in there in the bar and taken a cigar. And so we're gonna be really, and we smoked those cigars, and you can't really tell by that, but I wanted to kill myself. I was so sick. He didn't bother him at all, but I was, oh gee, I was terrible. That's some of the things.
Camp on the beach, and then one night it rained in the middle of the summer. We had to abandon the campsite as the rain poured down, and we didn't have tents, it was just a sleeping bag on the sand, you know.
Well, Steve Mosier and I and Johnny Sweek and Ted Bennett, we camped up the top up at College Cove. It was the first night of winter. We didn't realize that. And so Johnny Sweek lived right up the road. And so, right on the road you live on. And so, the next morning and there was frost on the end of our sleeping bag. They were nowhere to be found. They got cold and they got in the middle of the night and went and slept in his house. We didn't realize the first night of winter. Oh God, it was cold.
Oh, yeah, Kayla's sweet, his
That's
sister and
all
I
I
used to
have.
hang out, yeah.
Well,
I hope you didn't bore you.
I'm running out of energy.
Good place to grow up.
I was gonna say, it was really fun to hear your stories, but also to watch your reaction, you too, and
Well, yeah.
because it was your past.
Well, you got 3 of us here that were right in the middle of it, you know.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, all 3, I guess. And Catherine too.
I want to say that I lived in the Central Valley, and I used to come up here and go camping at Patrick's Point. It must have been just about the same time frame as you guys, although I may be older than you are. But it was really fun going up there. Camping was so hot in the Central Valley.
Oh, yeah.
And we would drive up there, and my dad didn't like to sweat, and he was just soaked, because by the time he got through Ukiah and everything, it cooled off here, but he was just, ugh. So he'd go in and take a shower, and then we'd go find a camping spot. It was really.
Well, when I worked at the Modern Garage, you get every kind of customer in there, of course, you know that. Really nice people and then some real jerks. And so this guy pulls in, and he was at a station wagon, and he was pulling this big boat. And he pulled in, and first of all, he didn't want me touching his car, he didn't want to put gas, he didn't want me spilling gas on it. He was just a real jerk. I wasn't doing a good job on the windshield. It's just everything I did was wrong. So finally, he gets ready to leave, and he goes, he was looking for Blue Lake. And he said, do you know where Blue Lake is? And I go, yeah, I know where Blue Lake is. And he goes, do they have can you put a boat in? Oh, yeah, they got a marina and everything. Yeah, this boat would be perfect for there. And so he was just happy to hell, and he drives on out of town. I said, I laughed all the way when he's like, "Hey, man, have fun." I don't know. I can't stand it. That was too
You know,
good.
we could go and get some refreshments and continue to talk.
No, we're done.
We could do that, and if anyone needs to pay dues, I can pay.
But I wanna see. So I got a story that